A billionaire buys out a local garage, then discovers the disabled veteran he evicted owns the land. In a small town overshadowed by big money and bigger dreams, one man's quiet life was shattered when a billionaire bought out the local garage he called home. But what the wealthy developer didn't know was that the man he evicted, a disabled veteran with a past carved in sacrifice and silence, actually owned the land beneath his feet. This isn't just a story about power and loss. It's about resilience, honor, and the unyielding strength of those who serve quietly, often forgotten by the world around them. Before we dive in, let me know in the comments where you're watching from. I love seeing how far these stories reach. And if you're new here, hit that subscribe button so you don't miss tomorrow's special video. I guarantee you won't want to miss it. Now let's jump in. In the small town of Silver Creek, mornings came with the steady hum of pickup trucks and the distant ring of the church bell. Tucked between an aging diner and a faded hardware store, there was an old garage. It wasn't much to look at: peeling paint, rusted signage, and a creaking wooden door that had seen better years. But for most locals, it wasn't about appearances. It was about the man who worked inside. People called him Jack. Just Jack. He was there every morning before the sun, moving with quiet discipline, his limp barely noticeable to those who didn't know what to look for. The garage was his sanctuary, a place where he fixed engines and, in his own silent way, held together the fabric of a town slowly being bought out by developers. He wasn't a man of many words. His eyes told stories his mouth didn't. Deep lines cut across his weathered face, and an old Navy SEAL cap, sun-faded and frayed at the edges, rested permanently on his head. Few asked about it. Fewer knew the weight it carried. There was a softness in him, too. Every Saturday, a little girl would wander into the shop. Sophie. No one really knew where her father had gone, and her mother worked double shifts at the hospital. Jack would set her up with crayons and paper at the corner workbench while he rebuilt carburetors and replaced brake pads. Sometimes he'd fix her bicycle. Sometimes he'd just sit with her in comfortable silence. The townsfolk respected Jack, though they didn't fully understand him. He never spoke of his past, but the clues were there. A folded flag encased in dusty glass sat on a shelf. A single photograph of men in camouflage, their arms around each other, tucked behind a cracked coffee pot. His right leg, stiff with every step, hinted at battles fought long before the engines he now tended. But the quiet rhythm of his life was about to be shattered. Across town, a man named Harrison Vale had arrived. A billionaire with sharp suits, sharper ambition, and a vision to transform Silver Creek into a modern hub. He was purchasing properties, fast, and few could resist his offers. Harrison didn't care for the old. He cared for opportunity. And that garage, sitting on the edge of his planned luxury plaza, was now in his way. Vale's lawyers arrived first, papers in hand, polite but firm. The garage was leased, not owned. Jack's contract, outdated and quietly buried in paperwork, gave Harrison the upper hand. Jack didn't argue. He just folded the paper carefully, placed it in his pocket, and nodded. The eviction notice gave him 30 days. 30 days to pack up a lifetime. 30 days to leave the only place where he still felt useful. But as the town buzzed with news of the buyout, what no one, not even Harrison Vale, realized was that Jack's silence wasn't surrender. It was patience. A patience earned in the deepest parts of the world, in places Harrison couldn't even pronounce. And Jack wasn't done yet. The days that followed passed like slow-moving shadows. Jack didn't fight the notice. He didn't storm offices or rally the townsfolk. Instead, he went on working, changing oil, fixing busted radiators, tightening loose bolts, as if the walls weren't about to be taken from him. But inside, something stirred. A familiar ache, not just in his stiff leg, but in his chest, a dull weight he hadn't felt since the desert, since the jungle, since places most people chose to forget. Word traveled fast in Silver Creek. Customers whispered about the eviction as they dropped off their cars. Some offered to start a petition. Others told Jack to fight it, to hire a lawyer, to stand his ground. But Jack just nodded, offering his usual quiet smile. Some battles, he'd say softly, aren't fought the way you think. Meanwhile, Harrison Vale's vision for Silver Creek accelerated. Bulldozers rumbled through nearby lots. Old shops were flattened, their owners paid and gone. Sleek glass towers, parking structures, and modern cafes were already mapped out. Harrison's team buzzed with excitement. One of his junior executives, a sharp young man named Blake, had been particularly eager to finalize the garage's handover. "It's just some rundown shack," Blake told Harrison over coffee one morning. "The guy's a fossil. Barely says a word. He won't put up a fight." Harrison didn't even look up from his tablet. "Make sure the paperwork's airtight. I want that lot cleared." Blake smirked. "It's a lease. He's got no legal footing." And on paper, Blake was right. The property deed didn't list Jack's name. The garage sat on a corner lot tied to an old holding company, a technicality lost in decades of filings. But what the lawyers didn't notice, what Blake never thought to question, was who owned the holding company now. Back at the garage, Sophie kept showing up. "You're not leaving, right?" she asked one afternoon, her voice small as she traced circles on a grease-stained notepad. Jack paused, wiping his hands on a rag. He crouched slowly to her level, his knee crackling under the weight. "Sometimes we have to let go of places," he said carefully. "But that doesn't mean we lose who we are." She frowned. "But who are you?" Jack's eyes softened, as if her question unlocked a door long sealed shut. He handed her a small keychain, a miniature anchor with faded blue paint. "It's a story for another time." But that time was approaching faster than anyone expected. That evening, Jack visited the town clerk's office. Not many people knew that he owned a few things beyond the garage. A quiet inheritance, the result of friends lost and promises made. He sifted through old records, cross-referenced dusty maps, and unearthed something no one else had bothered to check. It had always been there, right in front of them. The garage sat on leased ground, but the land beneath it? That belonged to him. A quiet purchase, made years ago, through the very holding company Harrison Vale thought he controlled. Jack folded the deed, slid it into his jacket, and stepped out into the cool night. The battle was already over. The billionaire just didn't know it yet. Morning came with the low rumble of heavy machinery. Harrison Vale's demolition crew arrived early, setting up barriers, idling their bulldozers just outside Jack's garage. Their orange vests glowed under the rising sun as they prepared to clear what they believed was the last obstacle in Harrison's grand plan. Blake stepped out of his polished SUV, sunglasses perched on his head, papers in hand. "Let's move this along," he told the foreman. The old man's had his 30 days. The crew hesitated when they saw Jack sitting by the garage's entrance, quietly tightening the chain on his front gate. His movements were slow but deliberate, as though he had done this 1,000 times. "You need to clear the premises," Blake called out, forcing a tone of authority into his voice. "Your lease is up." Jack didn't raise his head. He finished securing the chain, slipped the lock into place, and only then looked at Blake. "I'll be here a while longer." Blake's jaw tightened. "Listen, you're a good man, I'm sure. But this isn't personal. This is business." Jack's gaze didn't waver. "It always is." Blake turned to the foreman and waved him forward. "Cut the chain." But just as the crew began to move, a familiar figure approached from the street. A tall, silver-haired woman in a crisp blue blazer. Margaret Hollis, the town's property registrar. Blake frowned. What's she doing here? Margaret didn't answer him. She walked straight to Jack, handed him a folded envelope, and offered a quiet nod before stepping back. Blake snatched the papers from Jack's hand, scanning them quickly. His expression faltered. It wasn't just a deed. It was a layered ownership structure, signed, notarized, and still legally binding. The garage might have been leased, but the land itself? That belonged to Jack. Every square inch of it. Harrison Vale's carefully woven empire had overlooked one small, inconvenient detail. A detail buried under years of silent ownership and forgotten paperwork. Blake's voice cracked. This can't be right." "It's right," Margaret said, her tone cool and final. "You purchased a lease. The land was never part of the sale." Across town, Harrison received the news over a tense phone call. He listened, silent at first, then erupted in frustration. He ordered immediate legal review, but there was nothing to challenge. The contracts were airtight, just not in the way he thought. The billionaire had outmaneuvered himself, and the man he'd tried to erase from the town? Jack now held the one piece Harrison couldn't touch. But Jack wasn't interested in revenge. He didn't gloat. He didn't press charges against the demolition crew who had overstepped. He simply removed the chain, opened the garage doors, and went back to work. Later that afternoon, Sophie returned. "You're staying," she said, half question, half hope. Jack gave a rare smile, small but real. "Seems so. Did you win?" she asked. He paused, glancing around the old shop. "I never left," he said softly. But beneath that quiet answer lay decades of battles fought, sacrifices made, and a patience no billionaire could ever outbid. The story spread through Silver Creek like a slow-moving fire, quiet at first, then roaring through the cafes, the gas stations, and the church steps. Jack, the silent mechanic, had not only kept his garage, he had outmaneuvered a billionaire. But for Jack, life went on, unchanged in all the visible ways. He still arrived before dawn, still swept the same cracked concrete floor, still brewed coffee that tasted more like burnt oil than any roast worth naming. But something subtle had shifted. People lingered longer at the garage now. Customers who used to drop their keys and leave in silence started staying for a cup of that terrible coffee. They wanted to talk. Some wanted to thank him. Others just wanted to understand. One man, an older veteran named Curtis, finally broke the silence that had hung between them for years. "I heard what you did," Curtis said, his voice low, gravelly. "Didn't think anyone still fought like that." Jack shrugged. "Some fights just need waiting out." Curtis leaned in slightly, his eyes flickering to the folded flag on the shelf. "I remember hearing about a Jack Dalton. Operation Iron Veil. SEAL Team 6. Jack's hands paused mid-wrench. "I was there," Curtis added, his voice softening. "Afghanistan. 2002. Jack's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. Curtis took the hint. He stepped back, offering a simple nod. No fanfare. No further questions. Just quiet respect. That's how it started. Old faces began appearing at the garage, some strangers, some with familiar military posture, most with weathered hands and silent eyes. They didn't come for car repairs. They came for him. A soft network formed around Jack. Curtis, now retired, helped quietly in the background. Others passed by just to sit in silence, to share a cup of coffee that none of them actually liked, but all of them respected. Blake, meanwhile, was scrambling. The failed buyout had made him a cautionary tale inside Harrison Vale's empire. The billionaire had moved on to larger projects, but Blake was left to clean the mess. Out of desperation, or perhaps pride, Blake returned to the garage with a new offer. A buyout. "Fair terms," he said, laying the paperwork on Jack's workbench. "We can make this right." Jack barely glanced at the contract. "You're offering me what's already mine." Blake's smile faltered. "Look, I was just following orders. This doesn't have to stay personal." Jack finally looked at him, his voice calm but firm. "It was never personal. It was always about respect. You took that for granted." Blake tried one last angle. "You're sitting on valuable land. You could make more money than you'd see in 5 lifetimes." Jack's answer was steady. "I've already had 1 lifetime. It's enough." Blake's eyes narrowed, realizing there was no deal to be made here. No price that mattered. As Blake walked away, Jack picked up the anchor keychain Sophie had left on the bench. He turned it over in his hand, the edges worn smooth. Some men measured value in dollars, others in memory, and some, like Jack, in the quiet weight of promises kept. Blake's departure left a silence hanging in the garage, a silence Jack welcomed. But as the dust settled, the past began knocking on his door in ways he hadn't expected. One evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the cracked asphalt in gold, a black SUV pulled up in front of the garage. 2 men stepped out. They weren't from Harrison's company. Their posture was unmistakable, shoulders squared, movements economical, eyes that scanned the surroundings out of habit, not curiosity. Jack recognized them long before they introduced themselves. "Command sends his regards," the taller one said quietly, handing Jack a plain envelope. Jack raised an eyebrow. He hadn't heard from them in years. Maybe they'd finally stopped believing he could be pulled back in. "You're still listed on the reserve roster," the other man added, his tone more of a quiet joke than a threat. Jack gave a dry, knowing smile. "That roster's a ghost." "Maybe, but you've stirred attention. Higher-ups heard about what happened here. Thought it was poetic." Jack didn't answer. He simply opened the envelope and scanned the contents. Not classified, not orders, just a message from his old commanding officer, now retired. It read simply, "You may have left the battlefield, but the way you held your ground here reminded all of us what we fight for. You're not forgotten, Jack. You never were." The letter was unsigned. It didn't need to be. Jack folded it neatly, placed it in the drawer where few things resided: dog tags, a small notebook, and a photo of a team long scattered by time. As the two men turned to leave, one of them paused at the doorway. "By the way, the kid, Sophie? Her father served. Same unit you covered extraction for. He never made it back. She doesn't know." Jack's heart caught. A fragment of a mission returned to him now, sharp and vivid. He remembered the man, a quiet corporal with a photo of his baby girl tucked inside his vest. He'd been one of the last to fall during that operation. "She doesn't know," the agent repeated gently. Jack's voice was barely above a whisper. "She knows enough." When the SUV disappeared into the night, Jack sat alone, staring at the folded letter. That connection, unexpected and painfully intimate, tightened something inside him. All this time, Sophie hadn't just wandered into his life. She had been part of it long before she ever stepped through his door. Later that week, as Sophie sat at her usual corner, sketching with her crayons, Jack quietly repaired the chain on her bicycle, reinforcing it beyond what was necessary. His gestures were always small, but they held weight she couldn't yet understand. Some debts could never be repaid, but Jack would spend the rest of his life trying. The days settled into their familiar rhythm again, but beneath the surface, the air around Jack had changed. His garage, once a forgotten relic, had become something of a quiet gathering place. Veterans drifted in and out, some local, some from towns Jack had never visited. They came not because he called them, but because they had heard. Word of the Billionaire's failed eviction had traveled in circles Jack had long abandoned, passed from hand to hand, from base to base, like an unspoken rallying cry. These weren't men looking for a fight. They came to sit, to listen, to remember. Curtis was often there, occupying a corner of the shop, tinkering with small engines not because they needed fixing, but because the act of repair was a kind of therapy. Others followed. A former Army Ranger with a cane. A quiet woman with a long scar running from her jaw to her collarbone. One of the few who'd served in Black Ops units Jack knew by number, not name. They didn't talk much about the past. No one needed to. But Sophie, bright and curious, picked up on the growing presence around her. "Are they all your friends?" she asked one afternoon, swinging her legs from her perch on a tool chest. Jack looked around at the scattered figures, men and women weathered by time, but steady, dependable. "Some of them," he said. "Some are family." Her eyes lit up, like uncles and aunts. Something like that. Sophie's innocent joy cast a quiet light on something Jack had kept locked away. For years, he had distanced himself from attachments, telling himself the world he knew was gone, that his purpose had already been served. But the truth had been quietly rebuilding itself around him, piece by piece, person by person. It wasn't just a garage. It was becoming a sanctuary. But even as the bonds formed, the outside world hadn't forgotten Jack's stand against Harrisonville. A local reporter, a young woman named Emily, appeared one morning with a small notebook and too many questions. "I've heard the story," she said, her tone respectful, not prying. "But I'd like to hear it from you." Jack shook his head. "There's no story to tell." Emily hesitated. "People think there is. You stood up to the most powerful man in the county. No one does that." Jack returned to his work, voice steady. "I didn't stand up to him. I just didn't move." His simplicity disarmed her. Emily closed her notebook, sensing she wouldn't get the headline she came for. But before she left, Jack offered one small thread. "You want a story?" he said, glancing at the folded flag on the shelf. "There's a dozen names on that wall that no one remembers. Start there." Emily's eyes softened. "I will." And she did. The following week, the local paper ran a quiet tribute, not to Jack, but to the men and women whose names had gone unspoken. Their stories, long buried, began to resurface. Jack never asked for that, but maybe, deep down, he had always hoped someone would remember. The tribute in the local paper sparked something Jack hadn't anticipated. People started showing up, not the developers, not the city officials, but ordinary townsfolk. A woman whose brother had served but never came home. A young man whose father had fought in places he never spoke of. They came carrying photographs, medals, letters folded and worn thin from years of rereading. They didn't come for repairs. They came because they realized the man behind the grease-streaked hands and worn cap had quietly been carrying a legacy no one had seen. At first, Jack resisted. He didn't want to be anyone's symbol. He didn't want the weight of stories he couldn't fix. But slowly, he began to understand. They weren't asking him to fix anything. They just wanted him to hold the space, to be the anchor. It wasn't long before Sophie, in her usual curiosity, began collecting the stories. She'd sit at the workbench, carefully transcribing the names from the newspaper clippings into a small notebook Jack had given her. One afternoon, as Jack was replacing the timing belt on a battered truck, Sophie approached with her notebook, her brow furrowed. "Jack, why don't you tell your story?" He kept his eyes on the engine. "Some stories don't need telling. But I want to know," she said softly. "About you. About my dad." Jack's wrench slipped, his knuckles grazing the edge of the radiator. He barely flinched. "You know enough," he said, almost too quietly. But Sophie didn't back down. "People should know what you've done." Jack wiped his hands, the scarred skin darkened by oil. He sat beside her, his weight lowering onto the old wooden stool with a familiar creak. "Sometimes," he said carefully, "the things we carry so others don't have to." There was a long silence. Sophie lowered her gaze, tracing the edge of her notebook. "Is that why you didn't tell me about my dad?" Jack's breath caught. "You knew?" he asked, his voice barely more than gravel. Sophie nodded. "The men who came to see you, they talked. Not a lot, but enough." Jack felt the tightness in his chest grow heavier. "I didn't want you to carry that," he admitted. "But I already do," she whispered. The weight of unspoken history settled between them. Jack reached into his pocket and pulled out the anchor keychain she'd once left on his workbench. He turned it over in his palm, then placed it gently in her hand. "Your father carried this. He gave it to me when he couldn't take it any further." Tears welled in Sophie's eyes, but she didn't cry. Not there. Not yet. Instead, she gripped the anchor tightly, as if it connected her to a world she never knew. Jack's silence had always been his way of protecting people. But maybe, just maybe, it was time to let someone else carry part of the story. They sat together in that small, grease-scented garage, surrounded by the hum of a world that rarely paused. Sometimes the strongest bonds are built in silence. Sometimes the greatest honors are the ones never spoken. The quiet between Jack and Sophie deepened into something steady, something understood. She didn't push him for more, and Jack, in his own way, allowed her to stay closer, to ask questions he had long prepared himself never to answer. But outside the walls of the garage, pressure was mounting again. Harrison Vale's development plans had suffered a visible dent. Losing the garage had delayed his plaza project, and worse, it had sparked a wave of local resistance. Other property owners began to dig through their contracts. Some found holes. Some simply found courage. A fight was brewing in Silver Creek, not the kind fought with fists or firepower, but one fought with stubborn signatures, dusty records, and the power of refusal. Harrison, despite his wealth, was not accustomed to no. He returned to Silver Creek. This time, he came in person. He arrived at the garage unannounced, stepping carefully over the oil-stained driveway in his tailored shoes. Jack was at the workbench, his back to the door, as usual. "You're quite the local legend now," Harrison said, his voice measured but edged with irritation. "Didn't expect a man like you to cause me this much trouble." Jack didn't turn. He kept polishing the edge of a carburetor like the billionaire wasn't even there. Harrison approached slowly. "You know, I could buy everything around you. I could build the plaza anyway. Your garage would just sit here, an eyesore, surrounded by glass and steel. Jack set down the part, finally turning to meet Harrison's gaze. "You could," he said simply. "Is that what you want? To be the last relic in a town moving forward?" Jack's expression didn't shift. "I don't need to want anything. I'm just staying put." Harrison tried a softer tactic. "There's something about you. The way people talk about you now. They say you served special units." "That true?" Jack's silence held weight. Harrison smirked. "Doesn't matter. Whatever war stories you've got, they don't carry over to business. You may have won this little battle, but I build empires. You can't hold this ground forever." Jack's voice was quiet, but it landed like a hammer. "I've held worse ground for longer." For the first time, Harrison faltered. Jack stepped forward, not aggressive, but undeniably present. His limp gave rhythm to each step. "This isn't about winning. It's about knowing where to stand." The conversation wasn't loud. No threats, no bluster. But the message was unmistakable. Harrison looked around the garage, the aging tools, the faded banners, the quiet dignity layered into every corner. He realized, perhaps too late, that Jack wasn't just a man protecting property. Jack was protecting memory, a line in the sand. And Harrisonvale, despite his billions, wasn't equipped to cross it. Without another word, Harrison turned and walked away. The war was over. Jack hadn't needed to fire a shot. Harrisonvale's retreat wasn't broadcast, but people noticed. The demolition crews that had once roared through Silver Creek began to vanish. Construction signs quietly came down. Investors, sensing instability, withdrew. The luxury plaza plans slowly dissolved into paper trails and unanswered calls. But life at the garage continued as it always had, steadily, quietly. The rhythm of engine repairs and the soft scratch of Sophie's crayons filled the air again. But there was a subtle shift now. People no longer came just for Jack's skills. They came to be near something they couldn't quite name. Veterans lingered longer. Younger men, some recently discharged, began stopping by, not for service, but for stories, for advice, for silence they didn't have to explain. Jack noticed one of them, a young Marine named Evan, who kept showing up under the excuse of a busted alternator. It became clear after the third visit that Evan didn't need repairs. One afternoon, as Jack replaced a gasket, Evan finally asked the question he'd been holding. "How do you carry it?" Jack didn't look up. He knew what it meant. The weight, the ghosts, the long nights that didn't end when the mission did. "You don't," Jack said. "Not alone." Evan sat on an overturned bucket, his foot tapping nervously. "I thought I could leave it behind, that I could come home and just be normal again." Jack tightened a bolt with careful precision. "Normal's overrated." Evan let out a strained laugh. "Yeah, guess so." Jack's gaze drifted to the folded flag on the shelf. His voice softened. "You'll carry pieces of it, whether you want to or not. But you don't have to carry all of it." Evan glanced at him. "And you? Who carries yours?" Jack paused, his hand stilling. "Some weight stays with you," he admitted. "But there are people like you, like Curtis, like Sophie, who carry parts one can't." Evan lowered his head, breathing slowly, as if for the first time in weeks. Jack handed him a socket wrench, a quiet gesture that meant more than words. "Help me with this." It wasn't a request. It was an invitation. A simple reminder that the work, like the weight, was never meant to be shouldered alone. As the afternoon sun dipped behind the hills, Evan worked alongside Jack, finding brief moments of peace in the rhythm of turning bolts and shared silence. It was never about fixing engines. It was about fixing people, about holding space long enough for others to find steady ground again. Jack knew some wounds didn't heal, but sometimes what mattered most was knowing someone else was still standing with you. The garage had always been a place of function, tools, grease, parts, but now it was becoming something else. It was becoming a shelter. Curtis began showing up every morning without asking if he was needed. He simply made himself useful, sorting parts, sweeping the cracked floors, sharing the silence with Jack like an old habit neither of them could shake. The young Marine, Evan, returned too. He started calling the place his second home, though he never said it out loud. He just kept showing up, fixing what didn't need fixing, learning more about engines than he'd probably ever use. And Sophie, always nearby, carefully documented the names of those who passed through. Her notebook was now thick with stories. Some she had heard in fragments, some she had only imagined. In those pages, the invisible threads of service, loss, and memory began to take shape, woven together by the simple act of writing them down. One evening, as Jack finished locking up, Sophie approached, her hands clutching the now-worn notebook. "I think we should build something," she said. Jack raised an eyebrow. "What kind of something?" "A wall," she said, her voice small but steady. "A place for names. For the ones who didn't come back. The ones people forgot." Jack's gaze lingered on her, measuring the weight of the idea. He had spent years trying to forget, trying to carry the weight alone. But maybe it was time to remember. Not for him. For them. For her. Jack nodded. "Then we'll build it." Word spread quickly through the quiet network that had grown around the garage. Veterans donated scrap metal. Local tradesmen offered tools and welding equipment. Evan took charge of the physical work, pouring himself into the project like it was his own unspoken therapy. Sophie carefully painted each name on small metal plates, her hands steady, her heart in every brushstroke. The wall took shape along the side of the garage, imperfect, raw, but undeniably real. No speeches were planned, no ceremony arranged, just a day chosen, a quiet gathering. And when that day came, the people of Silver Creek arrived. Old friends, strangers, families carrying photos, veterans standing shoulder to shoulder, saying little but meaning everything. Even Margaret Hollis, the property registrar, showed up, carrying records of names long lost in forgotten files. Jack didn't speak to the crowd. He didn't need to. Instead, he simply walked the length of the wall, his fingers brushing lightly against the names. The final plate Sophie mounted herself. It read, "Jack Dalton's unit, brothers never left behind." As she finished, she looked up at him. "You were always carrying them, weren't you?" Jack's voice was low, almost a whisper. "They carried me." The wall wasn't about him. It was about them. It was about the weight we pass forward and the strength found in remembering. The memorial wall stood silent and unassuming in the fading amber light of dusk, a rugged testament etched in weathered steel and worn paint. It wasn't grand or polished like the shiny glass towers Harrisonvale dreamed of building. It wasn't meant to be a monument for tourists or investors. It was something far more intimate, a place for names that refused to be forgotten, for stories whispered in the quiet corners of the town, and for the souls that carried battles far beyond the ones fought on distant soil. Jack lingered near the wall as the last of the visitors trickled away, the hum of engines and soft murmurs fading into the gentle hush of night. His eyes traced the names, friends, brothers, and strangers alike, each one a thread in a tapestry woven with sacrifice, courage, and unspoken pain. The ache in his chest was familiar now, not just from the weight of memory, but from the burden of unseen battles that no metal could honor. Later that night, the garage was cloaked in shadows, quiet except for the faint creaks and groans of an old building settling. Upstairs, Sophie's soft breathing came from her modest room, a small sanctuary of crayons, sketches, and dreams. Downstairs, Jack sat alone at the workbench, the single bare bulb casting a pool of light onto an old photograph spread before him. It was a faded image, almost ghostly now, a younger Jack, flanked by his SEAL team, faces streaked with dirt and determination, eyes sharp with purpose. He traced the edges with fingers worn from decades of toil and hardship, fingertips lingering on the faint outlines of comrades who had been lost to time, to war, and to silence. The memories came flooding back in shards, the roaring blades of helicopters slicing through smoky skies, the oppressive heat of desert sands beneath heavy boots, the sharp crackle of radio static before a mission gone sideways. He saw the faces of brothers who never made it home, the hollow looks of survivors weighed down by grief and guilt. His right leg throbbed, a dull, constant reminder of the IED blast that had taken more than just mobility. But worse than the physical scars were the battles inside, fought in silence. The restless nights haunted by memories too heavy for words, The sudden flare of anger or sorrow he hid beneath a calm exterior. Jack's voice broke the stillness, a gravelly whisper to the empty room. We carry what we cannot leave behind. He paused, staring at the photograph as if seeking forgiveness or perhaps understanding. There was strength in that carrying, he reminded himself. The strength to endure, to protect, to remember, to keep fighting, even when the battlefield had moved into the quiet spaces of home and heart. Though the war had never truly ended for Jack, it had transformed. It was no longer fought with guns or tactics, but with resilience, presence, and memory. And with Sophie's laughter echoing faintly from upstairs, and the names on the wall standing as witness to sacrifice, Jack was learning to live with those unseen battles, not as burdens to break him, but as legacies to carry forward. The weeks following the unveiling of the memorial wall brought an unexpected calm to Silver Creek. The town, once bristling with tension and uncertainty, now breathed with a softer rhythm, one shaped by reflection and respect. Jack continued his work at the garage, but there was a new weight in his steps. Not the heavy burden of old wounds, but the subtle strength of a man who had reclaimed his place in a world that had once tried to erase him. One morning, as the sun broke through the mist settling over the town, a familiar hum filled the air. A convoy of vehicles, polished and purposeful, rolled slowly into Silver Creek. From them emerged a group of men and women wearing the uniforms Jack had long left behind. Some older, some younger, but all bearing the quiet discipline and dignity of elite service. They weren't here for ceremony or fanfare. They were here because Jack's story had reached far beyond the borders of the small town, touching the hearts of those who had shared his journey. Among them was Captain Reynolds, Jack's former commanding officer, who had led the team during their most perilous missions. Reynolds approached the garage with a steady gaze, his voice low and respectful. "Jack Dalton," he said, "we heard about your stand. About the wall. About how you never left the fight." Jack nodded, the weight of those words settling over him like a long-awaited acknowledgement. The veterans set to work, not to disrupt the quiet of the town, but to support it. They helped repair the garage roof, painted fresh signs, and restored tools that had been weathered by time. More importantly, they brought a renewed sense of community and belonging to a place that had once been just a mechanic's workshop. Sophie watched the activity with wide eyes, her smile brighter than ever. She ran to Jack's side, tugging at his sleeve. "They came back for you," she whispered. Jack looked down at her, a rare softness in his eyes. "We all come back. Some just take longer." As evening fell, the group gathered around the memorial wall. Stories were shared quietly, of battles fought, of brothers lost, of lives rebuilt. No speeches were necessary. The presence of these men and women, bound by shared history and silent respect, was enough. Jack stood among them, not as a hero or a legend, but as a man who had carried the weight of the past and found strength in the present. In that moment, the past and present converged, a quiet testament to resilience, honor, and the enduring power of brotherhood. The morning light filtered gently through the cracked windows of the garage, casting long shadows over the worn tools and grease-streaked benches. Jack pushed open the heavy door, the familiar creak echoing through the quiet space, signaling the start of another day. Though the veterans had left the day before, their presence still seemed to hum softly in the air, a subtle energy woven into the walls of the garage, as if the memories of brotherhood and sacrifice had found a new home. Sophie sat near the workbench, her sketchbook open, pencil poised in delicate fingers. Her drawings were evolving, no longer simple childish scribbles, but thoughtful, detailed scenes. A helicopter suspended in a cloud of dust, a group of soldiers locking hands in solidarity, a lone figure standing resolute against the chaos of war. Her eyes, bright and determined, reflected the quiet weight of understanding. She was beginning to grasp what her father's legacy truly meant, that the sacrifices of the past were not distant history, but living threads binding the present. Jack approached slowly, leaning against the bench with the careful weariness of a man who had carried many burdens. His voice was soft but steady. You carry a lot for someone so young. Sophie looked up, meeting his gaze. I carry what you give me, she said with quiet certainty. Jack nodded thoughtfully and reached into his jacket pocket, pulling out a small, faded dog tag, metal worn smooth by time and touch. He held it out gently. This belonged to your father. He asked me to keep it safe. Sophie's fingers trembled as she took the dog tag, its weight far heavier than any keychain or photograph she had held before. It was a tangible piece of a man she never truly knew, a connection across the years. Jack's voice lowered, almost a whisper. Our legacy isn't just the battles we fought out there. It's what we leave behind, the stories we pass on, the strength we give to those who come after. Outside, the town was waking. Neighbors walked by, their eyes lingering on the memorial wall where names once forgotten now stood proudly inscribed. Those names no longer belonged to shadows. They belonged to the living memory of Silver Creek. Jack's gaze returned to Sophie as she traced the dog tag slowly. It's not about glory or medals. It's about presence, about standing steady through the storm. Sophie smiled faintly, her voice soft but sure. Like the wall. Jack nodded slowly, eyes fixed on the rugged steel plates bearing the names of fallen brothers and sisters. Exactly like the wall. Together, they stepped outside, standing side by side beneath the cool morning sky and the silent witness of the memorial. The weight of legacy settled around them, not a burden to break, but a quiet strength to carry forward. And in that moment, the past and the future intertwined, carried gently by those who remember and those who never forget. The days were growing longer, and the early morning shadows no longer clung to Silver Creek with the same tenacity. The garage, once a quiet refuge of oil-stained floors and worn tools, had blossomed into something far more significant, a sanctuary of stories, memories, and healing. Jack found himself spending more time outside than inside these days, leaning against the weathered wooden doorframe as the sun warmed his back. The sound of children's laughter carried across the cracked pavement, sharp and unfiltered, an echo of innocence Jack thought had long been lost to him. Sophie sat surrounded by a group of neighborhood kids, her hands animated as she showed them her sketches of the memorial wall, her eyes shining with pride and purpose. It was in this moment of simple joy that a figure approached from down the quiet street. Tall, lean, moving with a purposeful calm that spoke of years lived in discipline. The man carried a faded backpack, and his eyes held a quiet respect as they settled on Jack. Jack Dalton? The stranger's voice was steady, with a cautious reverence. Jack's gaze met the man's. Depends on who's asking. The man smiled faintly, a trace of old camaraderie in his expression. Marcus, I served with your unit in Afghanistan. We never got the chance to say thank you. Jack's eyes narrowed just a touch, memories flashing behind his calm exterior, dusty desert nights, distant gunfire, faces he hadn't seen in years. You're a long way from the battlefield. Marcus shrugged, settling on a nearby crate. Some fights don't end when the war zone fades behind you. I've been searching for a place that reminds me why we fought. A place that holds the pieces of who we were. Jack gestured toward the garage and the memorial wall beyond it. Metal plates marked with names that had once been forgotten. You found it. As the sun dipped low and painted the sky with hues of orange and violet, Jack and Marcus sat side by side on the worn steps outside. The quiet buzz of life in Silver Creek softened under the approaching night. We all carry something, Marcus said softly. But sometimes, it's the presence of others that helps us bear the weight. Jack nodded slowly, the familiar ache in his leg a dull reminder of battles past. The weight never leaves, but the company you keep can make it lighter. At that moment, Sophie ran up, cheeks flushed with excitement. Come see. I'm teaching the kids about your stories. Jack's lips curved into a rare, genuine smile. It's not just my story anymore, he said quietly. It belongs to all of us. In a world that often overlooked silent strength, the gift of presence wasn't measured by grand gestures or loud declarations. It was in showing up, standing steady, and offering quiet resilience to those who needed it most. That night, the garage glowed softly in the cool twilight, a beacon of honor, healing, and unbroken promise. A sanctuary built not from stone or steel, but from shared memories, unyielding courage, and the enduring power of connection. Weeks drifted by like the slow turning of the seasons, and with them, the quiet momentum of Jack's stand began to reshape Silver Creek. The once looming shadow of Harrisonvale, the billionaire developer who had tried to sweep Jack and his legacy away, began to fade. His grand plans for the sprawling luxury plaza stalled, caught in the stubborn roots of a community unwilling to be erased. The town, like Jack, had found new strength in resilience and remembrance. One crisp afternoon, a small local news crew arrived at the garage. Cameras rolled gently, capturing the ebb and flow of visitors, veterans with steady eyes, neighbors with nods of respect, families clutching photos, and medals long tucked away. The reporter's voice carried the weight of reverence as she narrated the story, not only of Jack Dalton, but of the countless unnamed heroes whose sacrifices had been written into the quiet corners of Silver Creek's history. Jack watched from the shadows, standing near the edge of the gathering, his face calm but unreadable. Recognition had never been something he sought, not the glory of headlines or the fleeting spotlight, but now he understood its power. It wasn't for him. It was for the invisible ranks of men and women who had carried the burdens without ever asking for thanks. As the crew packed up their equipment, a familiar figure approached, Thomas Greer, the town's mayor. Once an ally of Vale's ambitions, the mayor now carried a humility born from witnessing the strength of a community united by memory and honor. "Mr. Dalton," Greer said quietly, extending a hand, his voice low and sincere. "On behalf of Silver Creek, thank you. You reminded us all what true strength really looks like." Jack stepped forward, taking the mayor's hand in a firm yet calm grip. "No thanks needed," he replied simply. "Just keep their names alive." Greer nodded, understanding the deeper meaning beneath those words. That evening, beneath a sky painted with the soft colors of dusk, Jack and Sophie stood side by side before the memorial wall. The long shadows stretched over the cold steel plates, each one etched with names that now carried new life. "You did it," Sophie whispered, her voice tinged with wonder. Jack shook his head slowly, a faint, weary smile touching his lips. "We did it," he corrected gently. This victory was not marked by violence or grand spectacle. It was a quiet triumph, a restoration of dignity achieved through presence, truth, and honor. In that stillness, the past and present finally converged. The invisible battles were acknowledged, the silent sacrifices honored. The quiet justice of remembrance settled over the town like a balm. And for Jack, for Sophie, and for all those who had carried their burdens alone, peace at last seemed possible. The dawn broke gently over Silver Creek, the first light spilling like liquid gold across the quiet streets and rooftops. The air was cool, carrying the subtle scent of dew and earth, a calm that seemed to settle into every corner of the town. Jack stood alone by the memorial wall, tracing a finger slowly along the cool steel plates that bore the names of the fallen. Each name was a story, a life woven into the fabric of this small community and the greater tapestry of sacrifice and honor. The wall, now weathered but resolute, reflected the soft hues of mourning. Jack's eyes scanned the familiar names, brothers and sisters who had once stood shoulder to shoulder with him, and those who had never returned from faraway battlefields. In this quiet moment, Jack felt the weight of the years settle gently on his shoulders, mingled with a profound sense of peace. Footsteps approached, soft and steady. Sophie appeared, carrying a small box wrapped in plain brown paper tied with twine. She moved with the surety of someone who had grown into her place beside him, not just as his daughter, but as the guardian of their shared history. "I found this in the attic," she said quietly, handing the box over. "It belonged to your father." Jack's fingers, worn from years of work and warfare, trembled ever so slightly as he unfolded the paper. Inside lay a treasure trove, yellowed letters, sepia-toned photographs, and a battered leather-bound journal, its cover softened and cracked by time. The scent of aged paper and leather rose up, an echo from a past that had shaped him more than words could express. He sat heavily on a nearby bench, the journal resting on his lap. With a steady breath, he opened it. The pages were filled with neat, deliberate handwriting, each line a fragment of a man's soul. Letters home written in long nights under foreign stars. Reflections on fear and hope. A longing for peace amid chaos. The journal was raw, honest, and deeply human. For the first time in decades, Jack allowed himself to read aloud, his voice breaking the silence with words that echoed the quiet strength he had inherited. We fight not because we hate what is before us, but because we love what we leave behind. Every day is a battle for the life we want to build, one where our children can dream without fear. Sophie listened, eyes shining with unshed tears, her hand resting lightly on his. The words connected them across generations, a bridge spanning time and hardship. "This is more than a memory," Jack said softly. "It's a promise." The room, though modest and filled with the scent of grease and engine oil, seemed to hold a sacred stillness. The journal was not just relic or record. It was a living testament to legacy, the courage to endure, the humility to carry pain quietly, and the hope to hand on something stronger than scars. Jack looked up at Sophie, his gaze steady but vulnerable. "Our fight isn't over, not really. But it's no longer just mine. It belongs to all of us now." Outside, the town began to stir with life. The hum of morning routines, the distant bark of a dog, the soft murmur of voices rising with the sun, each a reminder that peace was not absence of struggle, but the strength to keep moving forward. Together, Jack and Sophie rose and stepped outside, the box of memories between them like a shared torch. They stood side by side beneath the growing light, near the memorial wall where names glistened softly in the morning glow. The garage stood behind them, a humble building filled with years of sweat, resilience, and quiet redemption. The wall stood before them, a place of honor and remembrance. And between them, the stories of fathers, sons, daughters, brothers, and sisters flowed like an unbroken river. Jack breathed deeply, feeling the crisp air fill his lungs, grounding him in the present while tethering him to the past. In that moment, the journey that had begun with silent struggle and quiet displacement came full circle. A stand once taken in solitude had grown into a living legacy, one not forged in the chaos of battle, but built steadily through presence, honor, and truth. A legacy that would endure long after the echoes of war had faded into memory. A legacy that would carry on in the hearts of those who remember, and in the hands of those who continue to stand steady. Jack glanced at Sophie and offered a faint smile, less a victory, more a quiet acknowledgement. Together, they would carry the weight forward, not as a burden, but as a gift. The sun climbed higher, casting light on a future born of strength past and hope present. And Silver Creek, nestled beneath the vast sky, breathed with the unspoken promise of peace. Thank you for following this story. If you enjoyed it, please subscribe and share your thoughts below. Where are you watching from? Let us know in the comments. Stay tuned for more immersive tactical stories.